All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today. Good afternoon, everyone. Just as a friendly reminder, these webinars are intended for educational purposes only, and while we hope that you learn new information, the trainers that are presenting these webinars are not attorneys. Therefore, all information provided during the presentation and the Q&A session should not be construed as legal advice. All right, well, with that out of the way, good afternoon again. My name is Brianna Grimes, and I'm going to be your facilitator for the training today. We are going to be talking about pre-employment assessments and what you need to know about them. Just to keep in mind that if you do have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them into the question box, and they will be addressed at the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump into what we're going to be talking about today. All right, so today we're going to be talking about what exactly pre-employment assessments are, the types of assessments that you may come across or you may decide to use in your organization, why consider using these types of assessments, when to use these assessments, the legal compliance piece to engaging in pre-employment assessments, and then of course we're going to talk about the cost of pre-employment assessment because that's very important when considering if you're going to be using them. And then we'll finish off with a Q&A at the end if you have any questions. All right, so let's start off by talking about what a pre-employment assessment is. So it is a standardized assessment that is designed to evaluate candidates, their skills, behaviors, and or personalities in relation to the job position for which they're applying. Pretty simple. Essentially, it's a tool, and it's really a tool that employers will use to help you streamline your hiring process if that's something that you're looking to do. Additionally, the results of pre-employment tests, regardless of what type you utilize, are really used to determine whether or not the candidate that you're looking at is going to meet the requirements for the position for which they're applying. So again, this process can provide you with a lot more certainty and objectivity to your interviewing practices because of the way that pre-employment assessments are structured. Now, there are several types of assessments to choose from, and deciding which assessment fits your organization is best really is determined by the why. Why do you want to include assessments in your current process? What is going to be their purpose? This is really going to be key when deciding on whether or not this type of process add-on or process tool is going to benefit your company. Now, the different types of measurements, or excuse me, the different types of assessments all have different objectives. And the different types are hard skills, work sample, interview assessments, cognitive abilities, and personality tests. The most commonly used assessment tests that I'm sure some of you are familiar with are cognitive abilities and personality tests. And we'll talk about in a little bit why those are so commonly used. The least common that we're seeing nowadays is a work sample assessment. Now, a very common question that I get asked from clients is, should I use a pre-employment assessment? And that really tends to be a very difficult question to answer because some organizations may not benefit from pre-employment assessments, and it's really going to depend on your company culture, as well as your hiring practices and really what you're looking for, and of course, what kind of budget you have, because tools like this can get pricey depending on how you want to utilize them. So ultimately, the best way to answer this type of question is really to instead answer why you should use pre-employment assessments rather than should you use them or not. Because if you look at the why they should be used, you can really assess whether they're going to be beneficial to your company or not. The first reason that they should be used is because they significantly reduce your time to fill positions. So for example, if your organization has a lot of open positions, either due to a really high turnover in your industry or large amounts of growth, you may be looking to fill your positions fairly quickly rather than sit on them for 45 to 90 days, because you're limited on hiring staff. So by adding the assessment component to your hiring process, you can reduce the time it takes to fill open positions, therefore getting your candidates in as new hires, processing them quicker, and getting them on that training process to getting them hired. Now, the second reason is because they will improve the quality of your hires if you use pre-employment assessments correctly, and that is the caveat here. There is the ability to use these assessments incorrectly, and they won't increase the quality of your hires. But by using them correctly and using the correct type of pre-employment assessment, as well as standardizing this process for all of your candidates, you have the ability to hire the right person for the right job at the right time the first time. And this reduces your turnover because this person is going to be a good fit. There's really not going to be as much of a question of whether, they'll get along with the team or if they're qualified for the position, because you really weeded all of that information out during the interview and the assessment process. Now, another reason that piggybacks onto reason number 2 is that this also increases the likelihood of a long-term employment from this candidate. So if you have a higher quality of your new hires, then you will reduce turnover because they're a good fit for the job. And with reduced turnover, you'll have longer tenure in your company. So rather than having an employee that maybe only stays with you for 6 months because they were only slightly a good fit or they were looking for a job kind of in between jobs, you're going to find more qualified candidates that are going to want long-term relationships with their employer. They have a good fit, their personality fits with your current employee dynamic, and they may end up with your company for 3, 5, 10 years. So that's really what we're looking for when we want to add tools to our hiring process, is how is this going to benefit us, and essentially how is it going to save us money, because we all know that turnover costs money. The next reason, finally the last reason, is that based on the assessments that you use, you can easily identify candidates' strengths and opportunities from the start of their employment. So many assessments provide summaries on how the employee should be managed or how they should be coached. And some of them even provide summaries on their natural strengths and abilities based on their assessment answers. And this really provides your management team data on how to successfully manage this new hire, as well as how to use their natural strengths right away, rather than having to kind of work through that relationship and discovering these things, 90 to 120 days into the employment. So you can really get all that information up front and use it as a tool to engage your employees from early on. Again, like we talked about, decreasing that turnover. And it really serves almost as for a lack of a better term, an employee manual on how to, operate this particular new hire, based on their personality, based on, what their strengths and weaknesses are, based on their work experience and things like that. So a lot of these assessments can provide some really good insight that helps managers manage new employees. And again, that really helps to reduce turnover and increase longevity with the company. Then there is the question of, all right, so let's say we want to put assessments into play. When do we want to use the pre-employment assessment? And again, this is really going to depend on what your budget is first and foremost, and what utility you're looking to get out of this. So there are 3 main options on when to use these assessments. The first option is to use the assessments before the interviewing phase, kind of as a pre-screening strategy for all potential candidates. Now, keep in mind, this is going to be the most expensive option because you'll either need to pay for a lot of tests if they're, charging you per test, or you'll have to pay the yearly fee for what they call unlimited tests, depending on the packages, which we'll talk about when we get to costs. Now, the second option is to use these tests after the pre-screening phase. So you would have done an initial interview with the candidate over the phone, either by your recruiter or your HR, your hiring manager. Someone would have done an initial interview. And then once that person determines the candidate is qualified and should be moved on to that next stage, that is when they would take the assessment before the second round of interviews, before you start filtering out people into the final choices for your position. Now, this option can be moderately expensive, and it's really going to depend on your staff. If your hiring staff knows what they're doing, they know what they're looking for, they're well versed in interviewing practices, then it's going to be more likely that they're going to give you a good crop of candidates, and they're going to weed out those unqualified ones based on their resume and that first initial point of contact interview. Now, if you don't have a dedicated recruiting or HR person who has experience in recruiting and hiring and interviewing, this could get expensive because they're more likely to pass through unqualified candidates. And then once you do the assessment, you realize they're not qualified, they're not a good fit, and you've kind of wasted an assessment on them from a cost perspective. So it's definitely something to keep in mind if you're going to utilize this option. And finally, the third option is to use them during the final stages when you've narrowed it down to maybe 1 to 3 candidates for the position. So this is going to be your least expensive option because you're only purchasing 1 to 3 tests per position that you're trying to fill. And these tests can really help you decide which candidate would be the best fit if everything else is equal across the board, or even if your hiring team is really divided on who to select for this position. This can also be a really good tool because it can take bias out of the decision, because now you're basing your final hiring decision off of test results. That adds an extra layer of protection for you against violating any EEOC policies. But again, a caveat here is only if these assessments are used correctly. If they're not used correctly, they can actually open you to EEOC violations. So we want to make sure that if you are using this in the process, that you are using them correctly. Ultimately, this third stage is really what I recommend doing pre-assessment tests for, unless you have a large budget for hiring that you want to utilize, or you're really expecting to hire a lot in the coming year. Sometimes the cost of the yearly fee for unlimited testing is less expensive than purchasing tests individually. Another good option is if you don't have a dedicated HR or hiring person and kind of a little bit of everybody does the hiring. In order to get that consistency, these pre-employment assessments might be really good in that first stage before the interviewing phase, and the cost of the unlimited testing per year would be much, much less than the salary or the hourly pay that you would pay someone to be a dedicated recruiter or a dedicated HR person solely for hiring and compliance purposes. So this is really a good option for those types of companies that do hire a lot of people or have high turnover, but they don't necessarily want a dedicated recruiter on staff. Now, I want to circle around to the point I just touched on regarding biases and EEOC policies in hiring. So the next thing we're going to talk about is that legal compliance piece pertaining to pre-assessment tests, because that is something that everyone needs to be aware of, whether they use pre-employment assessments or not. So as far as legal compliance goes, there are two main components that employers must be aware of as it pertains to pre-employment assessments. And the first is what we call unconscious bias. And you may be familiar with this term, you may not be, but it's good to know that every single person alive today has some form of implicit unconscious bias. It's nearly impossible to not have some form of bias. Essentially, it's the biased way in which we perceive the world, and it's based on our stereotypes that we've either been made aware of or subjected to, as well as our views that have shaped us throughout our upbringing, our childhood, based on our race, our ethnicity, our gender, things of that nature that really creates this perception, which leads to these implicit biases that some of us may be aware of and some of us may not be aware of. So pre-employment assessment tests can actually help with limiting these unconscious biases that come up in the interviewing process. But our bias also exists when we are selecting candidates via their resume or even during that initial phone call when we hear their voice and the way they speak. It can also even crop up when we're meeting them for the first time based on what they look like, what they're wearing, how they present themselves. Those are all forms of bias. So this is something to really be aware of as you're hiring, regardless of whether you use pre-assessment tests or not. Now, another thing to be aware of is the potential violations of EEOC laws. So assessments can really open up the doors to violations, again, if you are not aware of how to avoid them and if you're not using pre-employment assessments correctly. So one example would be candidates with disabilities, like test-taking anxiety or even dyslexia. They may score lower on your assessment test and be disqualified for a position because of their disability, which would essentially violate EEOC practices. Now, oftentimes we think that the solution to that problem is to ask about disabilities or age or things like that on the pre-assessment test so we can find alternatives for those individuals before they even start the test. But actually, that would not be a good solution because asking about disability status or even age on an assessment test is in itself an EEOC violation. So these are good things to know when you're setting up this process if this is something you want to include, just to make sure you don't dig yourself into this legal hole. So as you can see, there are a lot of nuances about pre-employment assessments that have to be taken into consideration before implementing these types of things into your hiring process. However, many companies who design these tests, they are the ones who really come up with the solutions to many of these issues. And this is why legislation oftentimes supports certain requirements for pre-employment assessments. And so ultimately, these are the requirements that pre-employment assessments have to go through. So first and foremost, pre-employment assessments must be reliable, meaning that they have to measure what they say they're measuring. Many companies who design these tests have to go through extensive testing requirements before they're allowed to release these assessments to ensure the reliability of the test using statistical significance. This is another reason that we do not recommend creating your own tests. Going back to the different forms of tests I talked about earlier, I said that the least common test that we're seeing is work sample tests. And the reason that we're seeing less and less of those is because a lot of work sample tests are created by employers. And it's gotten quite a few employers into trouble with the EEOC because they created the test, but there was no reliability that this test actually tested someone's skills for the position. And there was a lot of discrimination claims that came from that. So that's why we're seeing a lot less of these tests being created by employers. And we're seeing a lot more of these big companies that have access to lots of data and local colleges that do studies in the psychology and sociology departments to create these tests for us so we know that they are reliable. Now, another qualification is that these tests must also be relevant to the role. And many court cases have supported the fact that all pre-employment assessment tests must be relevant to the role. So for example, you would not want to administer a typing test to, say, a lab technician. Typing abilities may be a part of the lab technician's job, but they may not be an essential responsibility of a lab technician. So a typing test would be more appropriate for someone who's a stenographer or a receptionist, where it's more part of a key role for that person. So it's really important to keep in mind that the test that you choose to provide to candidates must be relevant to the position that they are applying for, and it needs to either test their hard skills or knowledge in a certain area. Now, I know there's always the question on, well, what about personality tests? What does personality have to do with anything? Well, personality tests, on the other hand, have actually grown in popularity and significance over the last decade, and you can pretty much filter personality tests for just about any position category that most modern companies have. And the reason is because a lot of these personality tests, like I said, come from colleges, either from the psychology department or the sociology department, and they use a lot of the data that these colleges and big testing sites have access to. And so a lot of these larger companies and the more well-known assessment tests like the Myers-Briggs test, and I believe there's the predictive personality test, these tests are based off of thousands upon thousands of page of data that they have on people's personalities as they pertain to different job roles. So these larger companies that provide these assessments, as some of the ones that have been growing in popularity, are able to test different personality traits as they pertain to both hard skills, as well as how these traits pertain to certain job responsibilities and job roles. Sales is the most common one that comes to mind. There are specific personality traits that tie very, very closely with success in a sales role. And so that's ultimately what this data is telling us, and it has given us reliable measures of personality traits that correlate very highly with success in certain job categories. Now, thirdly, assessment tests must be standardized, and this means that you must apply them equally to all candidates. So if you have 3 candidates you're choosing between for a position, all of them would have to take the assessment test. You can't only test just 1 or 2 of them. Also, the test must be standardized to all candidates in that step of the hiring process. So if you choose to test 1 person or 2 people before they go to that initial interview, you're not allowed to do that. You have to test everybody in that steps for it to be fair across the board. And finally, the tests have to be objective. So both from a design standpoint as well as from an interpretive standpoint, when you or the hiring manager interpret the results of these assessments when you get them, you need to make sure that there are an objective amount of criteria on which you're making a hiring decision. So for example, if one of your criterion is that the person has to score, let's say a 60% or higher on the testing metric works well with others, that means that any candidate that scores below a 60% marker is automatically no longer in consideration in order to be fair across the board. And this is really to ensure that your hiring practices are fair and objective, and then they don't violate any EEOC discrimination. All right, so finally, we're going to talk about pre-employment assessment costs. So like I said earlier, they can be moderate to hefty costs depending on how you want to implement these assessments. Now, I left this section for last because while cost is not necessarily the most important determining factor when considering assessment tests, it can be a big deal breaker for small organizations if they can't justify the cost of the assessments. So just to give you an idea, the average pre-assessment test package averages about $5,000 to $10,000 per year for unlimited use for an average company of 100 employees with an estimated 20% growth. So usually this fee tends to include a setup fee, the assessments themselves, and then a yearly admin fee to have an account manager for you who, administers the test, sends them out, sends you the packets, and then helps you kind of interpret the test results and things like that. Now, most 100 employee companies can't afford that much money per year on assessments, especially when growth is not necessarily consistent or even predictable in some industries. And this is really why at PayEntry, we have decided to develop a system that caters to our small to medium-sized businesses that want to start using assessment testing for their organizations, but were maybe unable to afford it before. So we have decided to partner with a well-known testing company to offer per test pricing to our clients. And you essentially only pay for the test that you use, and you're billed monthly for the tests after you use them. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking our bulk pricing discounts that we get from these companies that we partner with, and we're passing those savings on to our clients. We even use these assessments internally, so we already understand how the test results work and how they should be interpreted as a consumer. We have also done away with that yearly setup fee and admin fee because we already guarantee our services and assistance to PayEntry clients through both our payroll packages and our HR services packages. So adding this on would simply be a cost on the per test basis if this is something you want to add onto your hiring practices. So if this is an option that you are interested in exploring, you can email either myself or Kathy after this webinar, and we can work with you to get a pricing and answer any questions that you have specifically about the tests that we offer. As of right now, we are offering personality tests as well as skills tests, and we are excited to start offering these to our PayEntry clients to enhance their hiring process in areas where maybe they couldn't before. All right, so if you did not get a chance, feel free to take a second right now and ask any questions that you have via the question box. Just as a reminder, this presentation was recorded and it will be available to watch again. To do that, you can visit www.payentry.com and hover your mouse over the webinars tab at the top and click on webinar recordings. The most recent recordings are typically on top, and these are usually posted within 24 hours of the live webinar. If you attended today, you will also be emailed a copy of the webinar recording tomorrow afternoon. There's also a survey that follows this webinar, so feel free to leave your feedback and let us know if you have suggestions for any topics that you want to see on our webinar schedule for 2021. We love it when you guys suggest topics for us because we really want to talk about things that you guys want us to talk about. So let's see what questions that we have. All right, so is there a seal? One question is there a seal or something that approves the companies and whether or not their assessments are reliable? Not really. There really isn't a lot of regulation on a lot of these assessments, which has proven to be an issue with a lot of the court cases. However, if they are the bigger companies, Big Five assessments, Elite assessments, Myers-Briggs assessments, the predictive index test, the ones that are very well known that they have psychological and sociological journals written about them, you can guarantee those are reliable. And the main reason is because they have to prove statistical significance before they can publish a test and start teaching it at the collegiate level. So if it's any of those types of tests that you're looking at with the bigger companies, I mean, those do have the big company price tag with them, especially if you want to go unlimited, but it is definitely worth it not to use a smaller company that you maybe have never heard of. And if you are exploring any companies, I highly recommend you ask them, how do you test reliability? You know, what other types, how long have you been doing testing? Can you kind of show me the data? Or do you have any journals written about you? Definitely ask some of those due diligence questions, because you don't want to get, I want to say suckered, but you don't want to get suckered into a company that's really green and isn't going to give you any of the value of a reliable test, if they're just going to create liability for you. So definitely do your due diligence if you are looking at companies. All right, another question. I didn't hear the second test, personality. Oh, we offer personality and skills tests, so basic hard skills tests. So if you're interested in that, definitely reach out, let me know, and I can send you a list of kind of what we offer, what the pricing would be, things like that. We can chat about exactly what you want to use it for, and we can find out if our system would be a good fit for you. Are the skills assessments customizable? No. So typically most assessments are not going to be customizable, because again, then you start toying with the reliability. You don't want to tweak tests too much. So if you're looking for a skills test for a specific position, for example, typing or multitasking, some of those general skills, those are some really good skills to test. But if you're looking for something maybe a little bit more niche, for example, if you're in a labor trade or something where you want to see if they can really tile or lay flooring or something like that, you can always cross-reference other work that they've done. But in terms of customizability of skills assessments, you typically want to go with what's already been developed, again, for that reliability piece. All right, well, it looks like there's no other questions at this time. So just a friendly reminder to you all, next week we are going to have a webinar talking about dealing with legalized marijuana at work. We have quite a few states in the United States that have legalized marijuana for recreational usage, and employers have a lot of questions regarding how that affects your workforce. So we definitely want to touch on that. Also, just a friendly reminder, the House, I believe, approved the stimulus bill, or they are going to be approving the stimulus bill here shortly. So Kathy is going to do a webinar on Tuesday regarding the stimulus bill, kind of what's included, what does it mean for us, and all of those fun updates. So be looking for an email from us probably tomorrow or Monday at the very latest, so that way you can register for that webinar too, because it's going to be chock full of good information regarding the new stimulus package. All right, well, thank you so much for your time today, guys. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we will see you next week.